There's hundreds of hours of footage with analysis of the war in Ukraine. Tens of thousands of hours, if not more, of unedited war footage, most of it available here on YouTube in all of its gory aspects. And there's hundreds of thousands of articles opining on how things are going and how they could go in this war, from all imaginable and unimaginable perspectives and of various quality of writing. One thing is missing though. How's ordinary life? Over the course of the month of May, I spent about 3 weeks in Ukraine in my longest stay in the country since the onset of the war, but also with the shortest list of things to do. Unlike other times, there was no immediate emergency for me. I didn't have some immediate supplies to deliver or someone that I had to contact as soon as possible. In other words, I had the time to do what I like: gather and tell stories, videotape, and think about things. Now, I could show you bombed buildings, or retell the story of the siege of Kyiv, or show you some frontline footage, or maybe tell the stories of internally displaced people. I certainly have gathered in the last month enough footage to do any of that, but much better funded enterprises have already done that. Sometimes better, sometimes worse, but it was done. Unfortunately, way too many people seem to think that a war zone must look like an abandoned piece of wreckage in Afghanistan, and footage like this is routinely spun as evidence that the war isn't that bad. Naturally, Russian propaganda exploits all of this to create new lines of attack in the information war, but one of the reasons some of these lines of attack land home is because far too many people have a pretty warped idea of what life under a state of war is like. And the reason for that is not just exposure to Kremlin-made narratives, but also the Western press, which, for various reasons, including profit, either do not discuss ordinary life at all, or when they do, they focus on life on the front lines. So, to cut through some of that noise, let's discuss about ordinary life during wartime for a little bit. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. The footage you're looking at was taken by yours truly about 3 weeks ago, or 13 months after the conclusion of the Battle of Irpin. This little suburb of Kyiv, located just half an hour by train from the core of the Ukrainian capital and separated by the homonymous river, was the front line in the overall battle for Kyiv throughout the month of March of 2022. Most of the attention of the international media in the period immediately after the Russian army got ousted from these lands was on Bucha, the town located further north in which the occupying force conducted extrajudicial killings, mass graves, and other reprehensible acts that are oh so familiar to everyone who has been living nearby the Russian problem. Both Bucha and Irpin are now martyr cities, and even though it's been over a year since these places haven't seen any fighting, the signs of the Russian problem having been around are still clearly visible. But, as I was saying in the intro, the purpose of this video is not to show you the extent of the physical damage of the war. There's limitless supply of that. What I wanted to show is how life goes on in spite of all of that, and to explain why none of this is specific to Ukraine, but more like specific to the general resilience of humans and human nature itself. You see, Us humans are very interesting creatures, as we're both fragile and strong. While the physical damage of the fighting is less and less visible today than a year ago, the psychological damage is still easily readable on the faces of the residents of Irpin and Bucha. In fact, you can figure out where exactly in the town the contact line was, as the faces of the residents south of it are generally brighter than of those living north of it. Or put it this way, those who lived under Russian occupation for a month have already developed a distinct set of mannerisms, a distinct way of walking up and down the streets, and a distinct look on their faces when in public. It's easy to notice it when you walk the streets of Irpin, and within minutes one will be able to quite easily tell who lived under occupation and who did not. There's plenty of research and literature out there about how people both individually and collectively process trauma, whether it's from natural or man-made disasters. It's quite an interesting story if you fancy studying the minutiae of psychiatry. But the flip side of the scars of trauma is the strength of people, again, not just of Ukrainians in particular, to pick life where it was left off when things went wrong. Most people in the West these days seem to think that in a war, everything just stops. And it is this belief that Russian propaganda successfully exploits from time to time. Here's an example. While I was still in Ukraine, the president of Kyiv School of Economics, Mr. Timofey Milovanov, posted this video on Twitter, showing a McDonald's in the capital. The video gathered over 25 million views. In addition to the usual bots and paid shills, among the reactions this video received was a genuine surprise that McDonald's is still working in Kyiv. These aren't vatniks or paid shills, but people who genuinely think that war stops everything. CNN interviewed Mr. Milovanov a few days ago with the same question: how come the city still functions while at the same time being under constant attack? This is one of the reasons I'm wary of publishing images like these. You see, there is no polite way of saying this, so I'll just proceed to tell it like it is. Too many Westerners have watched too many war movies and too many highly autistic YouTubers. And the Western media doesn't help either, as it hasn't accurately portrayed life under a state of war for decades now. In the real world, civilian life during wartime is restricted, but not abolished altogether. There are still people alive today born between 1939 and 1945 in active war zones. How do you think their parents met? Well, it was oftentimes at events just like these ones, and many others that I did not catch on camera. It is indeed quite remarkable what a dearth of footage there is out there about ordinary life during wartime. And not just in this war, but most recent wars. Though, to be fair, if one looks up in Ukrainian or Russian, there's plenty of contemporary footage from all over Ukraine, but this is what Russian propaganda relies on: the language barrier. For too many Westerners, Ukraine is an unknown or uncharted place. Heck, I even met a few such people in Ukraine itself over the years, but at least those people were courageous enough to at least visit before issuing categorical pronouncements. Needless to say, almost all had to change their mind, even if partially, after spending a few days around this place. But back to ordinary life during wartime. This isn't new. In the United Kingdom, football matches with a full stadium were held during air raids. Street concerts, just like these ones, are in fact a common fixture in nearly every war. In 1992, for instance, during the siege of Sarajevo, this man, Vedran Smailovic, became known as the cellist of Sarajevo because, well, he was playing his cello in public in an active war zone. Then there's Eham Ahmad, who became a YouTube star in 2013 by playing piano in the ruins of a neighborhood in Damascus, Syria. A neighborhood also destroyed by Russia, by the way. Similarly, this cellist played his cello last year in the streets of Kharkiv, which was also destroyed by Russia. In fact, many of these performances also serve as fundraising events for the armed forces. This isn't special either. The United States itself did exactly the same a bit over 80 years ago. In fact, the US fundraising effort was slightly more compulsory than these ones seen in contemporary Ukraine. The Hollywood Victory Caravan was an idea of the US Treasury Department and consisted of a literal trainload of 50 Hollywood names making whistle stops across the country to sell war bonds. They had no trouble getting stars because Who in Hollywood had the guts to tell the IRS that they're out of town? In contemporary Ukraine, these efforts are not centrally coordinated and rarely part of a government initiative. Times have changed, but the fundamentals remain roughly the same. Besides, supporting the war effort isn't cheap. Foreign aid helps a lot, but a country the size of Ukraine can't function predominantly or entirely on that. And it doesn't. That's why any part of the economy that can function does indeed function. From essentials such as electricity and water distribution, manufacturing of construction material and other goods, and all the way down to things like production of artistic products, selling coffee, and yes, concerts and events, especially in the western part of the country. Now, I didn't attend the concert because the music available was far from my taste, but at least one big concert in public was organized in the 2 days I spent in Lviv on my way back home.
Yo, midi, mirai. Fucking me down, ждем зустріч вітрам, ловим моменти молодіші там високо.
Now, the problem with discussing this is that some things can't easily be documented on camera. So, for instance, I can't show you the military police patrolling the streets. Videotaping active duty personnel is, of course, not permitted, and it's also one of the very few martial law restrictions that it's somewhat enforced, in the sense that you're politely required to delete it. In a crowded city, that can be a problem because there were lovely things that I saw that I could not videotape due to this restriction. Oh, speaking of martial law restrictions, both the pro-Ukraine people and the pro-Muscovy shills have been misrepresenting the situation as a matter of routine. So, for instance, it is routinely repeated by various shills, and unfortunately parroted by otherwise good-faith people, that youngsters are either all gone from Ukraine or they're afraid to go out on the streets for fear of being drafted. Well, I guess nobody told that to these youngsters. In reality, it is a bit more complicated. For starters, in cities on the front lines, such as Kharkiv or especially Kherson, almost nobody goes out on the streets, not for fear of being drafted, but for fear of being shelled by Muscovy. Secondly, yes, there is a draft, but more often than not, the number of volunteers is higher than the necessary, so in practicality, it routinely depends on the local authorities. You see, nobody chooses to become a wartime leader, from alderman to mayor to president. When war breaks out, you have to work with whomever happens to be in position of authority at all levels, at least in quasi-democracies. Speaking of Kherson, one of the reasons I did not go there with my camera this time around is because the curfew regulations changed multiple times during the month of May, including a weekend-long curfew with no way to get in and out of the town. And since some of the elected officials of Kherson defected to Muscovy earlier during the war, the situation is treated much more rigidly by the military administration. So, for instance, not observing the curfew in Lviv will, at its worst, result in a night in jail and a fine. Doing the same in Kherson will result in 15 days in jail and then being deported if one is a foreigner. In the capital city, not observing curfew routinely ends with being escorted to your place of residence. But an overzealous police officer may have you sleep in your car or in jail. In the far west, in Transcarpathia, there is no curfew. I usually joke that the reason for that is because there is no need for one. This is a predominantly rural region, very far away from the front lines, and whose way of life has no room for nightlife of any kind. The only change brought by the war is that employees from non-stop businesses now have an excuse not to work late. The reason I'm mentioning all of these details is to paint a more realistic picture of what ordinary life during wartime looks like. The Russian media has been insisting non-stop that this is just a special military operation and that civilians are unaffected. That is a lie. The Western media has been insisting that civilians live in a constant state of fear of their lives because of the actions of Muscovy. That is true in some parts of the country, but a bit inexact in others. For instance, sleeping at night in Kiev can be quite challenging due to the constant attacks by Muscovy. If the air raid alarms don't wake you up, the loudness of the air defense systems taking down Russian missiles and drones will likely wake you up. And if you're really unlucky, the sound of debris falling on your building will not only wake you up, but maybe sometimes injure you as well. The further east you go, the higher the risk. The further west you go, the lower the risk, but still not zero. For instance, this is how I woke up in Transcarpathia one day. Now, to be fair, there are also situations where the air raid alarm is a bit excessive. But it's also true that the decision to turn it on is made locally, hence you work with whomever happens to be in position of authority when war breaks out. The local authorities in Mukachevo are a bit on the panic side, while the local authorities in other towns and cities are not. While I was woken up by an air raid alarm in Mukachevo, my friends 40 kilometers west in Uzhhorod were not. With that said, this faraway region is also on Muscovy's mind. Just a few weeks prior to me taping these images in Transcarpathia, here's what was running on Russian TV.
К сожалению, действительно есть у Запада договоренность, у американцев есть договоренность с Китаем и с Индией. Если мы действительно применяем тактическое ядерное оружие, и это сопровождается большими жертвами, то как бы те страны будут от нас отвернуться. И Индия, и Китай. Ну, есть такая информация, во всяком случае, в западных СМИ. Насколько это объективно, мне сложно судить, но, извините меня, но есть ведь территории, где практически нет населения. Я имею в виду те же Закарпатья, которые связывают Польшу с Западной Украиной. Там есть 9 переходов, это транспортные артерии, мосты, там различные туннели и так далее, где практически никто не живет. И мы не ведем речь о взрывах мощностью 20 килотонн, как это было в Хиросиме и Нагасаки, но 1, 2, 3 килотонны, которые могут находиться, например, в каком-то боеприпасе небольшом, конечно, они могут серьезно разрушить именно то, что обычные средства поражения не разрушают.
Now, of course, this is very likely an empty threat, but still, imagine living in this quiet, mostly rural and very peaceful and diverse region and waking up hearing the air raid sirens and reading the news that a neighboring country is pondering nuking you. This doesn't bode well for mental health. And this is why I'm making this video. The people who think everything stops during wartime, or that everything should stop, or, as I've heard multiple times, that it's immoral to hold happy events during wartime, all of those people really don't understand how humans work. Living in a perpetual state of fear is not only terrible for one's mental health, but it's terrible for the war effort itself. A non-functional economy can't fund the war effort, and after all, this is the intent of the enemy. To demoralize. And the reason this strategy generally fails is because humans eventually snap out of it. It happened in Israel decades ago. The risk of terrorism remained very high and very real for over a decade after the people decided that their human need for happy events and contact is much more important than staying alive at all costs. It happened in Syria and Iraq just a few years ago, it happened during both world wars, and is happening now in Ukraine, and it will happen again. Now, of course, this is a complicated discussion to have now as the war is still ongoing. This passionate discussion about ordinary life during both world wars, for instance, became permissible in polite society merely a few years ago. But I'm counting on the wisdom of my otherwise small audience to discern between emotions. What is happening or has already happened in multiple parts of Ukraine is a tragedy, and we can only hope that those responsible will eventually be held to account. But not even tragedies of such high proportions can stop life from going on. During every war, new families are being formed, children are being born, stuff gets manufactured, life events happen, and, God forbid, people are having some fun too from time to time. And in the case of Ukraine during wartime, even unironical tourism still happens. Less than before the war, and more often by people who are accustomed with the place, but it still happens. Ultimately, those set in an opinion are unlikely to change it, but one should still be cognizant of the facts. Life in Kyiv is mostly normal, but it's also this. And sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. Also, Ukraine in general, and Kyiv in particular, is a big place territorially. Way too many Europeans seems to think in terms of smaller metro areas like Copenhagen or Vienna. But in fact, as a surface area, Kyiv is more comparable with the Stuttgart metropolitan region, with a surface way in excess of 5,000 square miles or over 13,000 square kilometers. So it is entirely possible for Muscovy to launch an attack on Kyiv and over 1 million people in Kyiv to not even be aware of it. That doesn't make the attack any less terrifying, and your little Telegram video from the other end of the city doesn't prove it's fake. It's merely geography at play. And there's one more reason why propaganda aimed at downplaying the effects of the war oftentimes works. It's been so long since there hasn't been a war in Europe that Europe cares about. The Yugoslav wars weren't really taken seriously in Western Europe, or the initial invasion by Muscovy into Ukraine in 2014, not to mention the invasion of Georgia, also by Muscovy. And Russia relies precisely on this fact, that the public is ignorant. Most of what the public knows about ordinary life during wartime is from stories from their grandparents, and only if they haven't institutionalized their grandparents. Also, Ukraine is approaching the war in mostly classical ways, but also with some twists. So, for instance, there is no food rationing, largely because Ukraine is a global top producer of food. So the Anglophone public is susceptible to various types of messaging because the Anglophone public, if cognizant of history at all, associates war with food rationing because that's how it was done in Britain. Normally, countries at war switch to a war economy. Of course, Ukraine did the same, but with some twists. Oftentimes, countries at war increase taxes and the state's control over the economy. Ukraine did mostly the opposite. It suspended some taxes, lowered some others, and encouraged a functional economy to the fullest extent possible. Such an approach is rare and unheard of in the last century. For those who value liberty, you should hope Ukraine wins, and in doing so, providing a contemporary example of a liberty-oriented approach prevailing over the barbarity of socialism, both of the Putinist kind and of the Evrosayuz kind. The Lolbertarians who more or less support Russia are the funniest people of all, since most Lolbertarians are, for sure, enduring a much higher fiscal burden in their own countries than a regular person is enduring in Ukraine right now. Yes, the discussion is complicated, yes, nuance is routinely sacrificed, and yes, there's plenty of propaganda on both sides, but none of that is an excuse to being ignorant while at the same time making definitive pronouncements in public with no connection to reality. So, to sum up, life in Ukraine under a state of war goes on. In some parts quite normal, in a lot of parts as normal as it can possibly be, and on the front lines as you would expect. In other words, nothing particularly special if one is cognizant of how war actually works in practice. During the Yugoslav wars, you had Zrenjanin, where life continued entirely as normal, and Sarajevo, where at times ordinary life indeed had to shut down. The same is true now, or has been true for the last 15 plus months of this phase of the Russian aggression. Will things change? Well, over a long enough period of time, yes, of course. All wars eventually end. But over a shorter period of time, I don't know, man. In war, one thing is guaranteed: instability. What is true today may not be true a week from now. So yeah, I hope this video at least puts things into perspective. Now, let the hate flow. But please keep some hate for the next video when I go into the language issue. So with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your continuous and generous support. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.